Hi, my name's Stephanie Cook. I'm an English master's student at Western Carolina University, and today I'm presenting to you my paper, which is an ecocritical literary analysis entitled Scheduled to Die: Human Nature and Ecological Community as a Response to Consumer Death in Don DeLillo's White Noise. In 1976, the city of Seveso, Italy, was inundated with a toxic cloud that killed thousands of animals and sickened nearly all of the town's human population as a result of an industrial accident at a Swiss perfume factory in the region. Shortly after, in 1979, 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania was the site of the most significant nuclear power accident in American history, acutely impacting nearly 2 million citizens and degrading the surrounding environment for decades. By 1984, the Bhopal gas disaster in India had been dubbed the worst industrial disaster to date, affecting nearly 1 million Indian residents in the region, as a multinational company's pesticide factory leaked toxic fumes. This brief period before White Noise was published in 1985 saw a slew of additional eco-catastrophes, creating vast and lasting impacts on the environment and humans' sense of themselves within the natural landscape. In a way, humans were experiencing a forced awakening to the destruction they had caused and hidden from themselves for the century following the Industrial Revolution and its massive capitalistic economic growth. Don DeLillo's White Noise presents a tale of capitalism's overtake of all other human priorities, which forces an artificial choice between economic progress or an authentic natural self. This unconscious decision that the story's characters must grapple with create a separation or border between their human world and the environment, as well as the non-human beings within it. Ultimately, this division causes an existential crisis for many characters as they grapple with their reality as it truly is, and not as it has been presented to them through a multitude of Baudrillard's simulacra, designed to hide the truth of their separation from them. Presenting a stark observation on modern American life, DeLillo uses the characters in his book to discuss Americans' fragmented reality, far distanced from their environment and their resulting loss of self. DeLillo's tale is at its core an environmentalist cry for humanity's awakening to its impact on nature, and a call for an idea akin to Timothy Morton's ecological thought as the only way to bring the species back in touch with its own human nature. Through the character of Jack, White Noise introduces an environmentally unconscious being content to inhabit a consumerist world where he is isolated from the natural realm, who, by experiencing a near death resulting from an environmental disaster, begins to accept his need for connection to both his community and the ecological landscape at large. With the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and early 19th centuries came monumental growth in human capabilities and worldly reach. But along with that came an increasing suggestion of the commodification of nature, one in which the only inherent value in something was its worth for human use. Carla Armbruster purports that nature was viewed as, quote, a laboratory full of things, end quote, there exclusively for the use of humans as they moved up the economic and thereby power ladder. The American 20th century which followed, particularly post-World War II, was one that created modern corporate capitalism, ultimately causing the connection between man and nature to break down. Capitalism's separation of man as no longer part of the natural world led humans to increasingly desire some authentic or even primeval experience with the environment, creating a dichotomy in attitudes with objectification of nature on one hand and a romanticized nostalgia on the other. A contradiction which created an idea that humans still had in them this primitive version of themselves that, as Armbruster puts it, quote, we always long to return to but cannot, end quote. The world of capitalism is a world of the artificial, one built by humans for humans. These built environments play a significant role in White Noise, specifically seen with the supermarket and mall, which not only serve to physically separate the characters from their natural environment, but also attempt to recreate it from a human-centric perspective. In this world, consumption is the goal, and the purchase of these goods promises a way into a civilized wholeness, fully detaching the origin of products from the version displayed. Separating humans within their own built environments distances them from other non-human beings, and this separation allows for the resulting environmental degradation as it enhances human-only goals. Harold Fromm argues that humans are not only separating from nature, but in a way even from a higher being, as long as they no longer as they no longer need to transcend their reality to a heavenly plane because all their mortal needs are presently met, creating an alteration of their experience of nature, one which does not consider the inputs and wastes created as part of the consumerist lifestyle. Martin Amis picks up particularly on the idea of waste and excrement with his, quote, toiletization of the planet, end quote, where American and consumerist culture as a whole have become defined no longer by what is produced, but by the waste that is created. Through emphasis on waste, consumer cultures have created what Cynthia Dietering terms a toxic landscape, which serves, quote, as a metaphor for the pollution of the natural world and attempts to show how that contamination inevitably transmogrifies one's experience of the earth itself, end quote. Generated waste plays a central role throughout the story, as DeLillo represents waste as a means of self-expression throughout white noise. In the book's first part, Jack describes his town as, quote, a town of tag sales and yard sales, with the failed possessions arrayed in driveways and tended by kids, end quote, defining his town as having a type of throwaway culture where waste is cast upon the poorer class so that the middle class consumer can clear room for new possessions. Later, Jack comes face to face with his own family's waste as he goes through their garbage can looking for his wife Babette's prescription. With a sense of disconnection upon inspection, Jack questions the garbage's origins. Quote, is this ours? Did it belong to us? Had we created it? End quote. Going through the family's waste wakes Jack's toxic consciousness so that he is truly able to see the results of their consumerist lifestyle. As he sifts, he even imagines gaining a deeper sense of his household and family through their garbage than through his own relationship with them. During the disaster, as the toxic cloud is forming, Jack begins to see clearly the waste that fills his home, remarking, quote, abandoned possessions were everywhere, oppressive and soul-worrying, creating a weather of their own, end quote. On multiple occasions after his toxic exposure, and as he begins contending with his own death, Jack comes home with a sense of renewed purpose and begins purging the accumulations of his consumerist lifestyle, participating, in a way, in the same failed possession culture with which he critiques his town. As Jack grapples with his own mortality and fear of death, one of the few things that brings him a sense of calm is removing the excess and waste from his own life. Extending from built environment and waste compartmentalization are the larger constructs of the book's towns and cities. DeLillo's choice to name the towns after the goods and natural resources they either create or exploit, i.e. Iron City, Watertown, Glassboro, Coaltown, Blacksmith, etc., creates for the reader a grander scale recognition of the commodification of the natural world for human use. Excuse me. Using this focus, DeLillo subtly alludes to a binary class structure where the wealthy can afford to live in the small rural towns, which Jack describes as closer to nature, and the poor and generally minority form communities and cities, which are apocalyptic hellscapes, according to Jack's analysis. Jack's binary between towns and cities presents a view that the wealthier a person is, the closer to nature they are. Indeed, even Jack's close confidant and co-worker Murray approaches the topic of towns versus cities and their connection to death, saying, quote, in cities no one notices specific death. Dying is a quality of the air. To die in an apartment instead of a house can depress the soul, I would imagine, for several lives to come. In a town there are houses, plants, and bay windows. People notice dying better, end quote. The sentiment that the wealthy are closer to nature is, of course, false, as across the globe, poorer communities are much more connected to their direct environments, and wealthier countries may be nearly completely isolated from the natural state of their habitats, as well as their actions upon them. The scene comments on modern capitalist cultures, where only within a society that values money and consumption the way American society does, would one think that one's wealth in life would have any impact on their status in death. The disconnect from capitalism's actions with its consequences to the environment is perpetrated by simulations ubiquitous within the cultural and environmental surroundings of white noise. One of the most consistent simulacra is the persistent idea of, quote, nature, end quote, within the story. Early on, Jack visits the, quote, most photographed barn in America, end quote, giving the reader a taste of the false reality that this world has created for itself. The photos that viewers of the barn take become the experience of the barn itself. The barn is no longer important in the narrative. The fact that one has stopped to photograph it is all that matters. Quote, "Once you've seen the barn, it becomes impossible to see the barn," end quote, Murray states, continuing, quote, "We're not here to capture an image, we're here to maintain one," end quote. The idea of maintaining an image of nature is one that is echoed by America's national parks, where the stated goal is not to preserve an area, but rather to create an area that, as Alison Byerly states, quote, "appears impacted only by nature," end quote. The parks present an area that to its viewers appears real, but instead merely creates an illusion of reality. The barn in this scene then represents an idealized interpretation of nature, one defined not by its naturalness, but by its simulation of how humans view wilderness. White noise furthers this portrayal of nature through representations of other natural elements within the story, particularly animals. Present throughout but never appreciated intrinsically, animals are commodified with respect to their value to the human characters in the story. There is a clear separation between the human and non-human world, which insists that humans at one point were part of the natural world, but have since been exiled from it. The presence of nature documentaries as background, or white noise, within the story adds to this separation, presenting human actions as the only way to save a natural world that they have destroyed. Jack's kids have memorized the science facts regurgitated to them through television programming, and at the story's end, the drug dealer Mink even uses these same facts to ground himself while he fights for his life against Jack, quoting from the programs directly during the brawl. However, the information presented in these shows is clearly anthropocentric, in one instance reporting that an animal had, quote, "developed a complicated stomach in keeping with its leafy diet," end quote, neglecting the evolutionary fact that it is actually the diet that dictates the stomach's capabilities and not vice versa. Rather, the animal is compared to a machine where its parts are made in response to a need, which is the opposite of what is naturally occurring with evolution. Reverse anthropomorphism is a coping mechanism Jack utilizes as he struggles with his place in the ecological community, enabling him to feel a connection to the natural world through his narrative comparisons between human and non-human beings. Christopher Maines, via Foucault, maintains that as human societies become humanistic, quote, "shifting from an animistic to symbolic presence, human culture is such that only humans have status as speaking objects," end quote. Rather than anthropomorphizing, Jack relies on the reverse, where he describes everyday occurrences in ecological terms, relating them to animal and plant characteristics. This reverse anthropomorphism is an unconscious attempt to give voice to the voiceless, to allow nature to speak back against the human atrocities she is witnessing. This behavior makes sense for those perceiving this man-made boundary, and it creates a connection between the human and the non-human world. Reverse anthropomorphism flows throughout White Noise with abundant examples, as Jack describes various scenes he observes. Speaking to a colleague, Jack describes his response, saying, quote, "An abrupt emotion entered his voice, a scrape, a gargle that sounded like the stirring of some beast's ambition. He gaped at me and gestured. He croaked," end quote. Later, in the mall, he observes a group of people saying the sounds they make are like, quote, "a great echoing din, as of the extinction of a species of beasts," end quote. While describing the scene of an airplane malfunction, Jack remarks on the noises people made as, quote, "not so much words and actions as terrible and articulate sounds, mainly cattle noises and urgent and force-fed lowing," end quote. He further describes a woman's outfit, saying, quote, "she put on a long glossy padded coat. It looked segmented, exoskeletal, designed for the ocean floor," end quote. Indeed, these reverse anthropomorphism examples could go on, and once one starts looking, it is actually difficult to notice Jack describing any person or scene in any other manner. It is as if an unconscious awareness of his otherness from the natural world insists that Jack sees these scenes from a nature-centered focus. He is experiencing the beginning of a toxic consciousness, one that is greatly propelled by the airborne toxic event which soon occurs, ultimately leading to an existential crisis as Jack contemplates his own death. A major shift in the story happens during part 2, the airborne toxic event. While the reader knows by this point of Jack's preoccupation with death, it is only after this toxic event that the severity of the issues truly come to light. This closeness to his own death because of the disaster finally unearths Jack's will to live, and as a result brings about his obsession with death. The resulting environmental destruction witnessed and experienced by the main characters marks the turning point, particularly for Jack, in his version of Morton's ecological thought. The major environmental disasters, of which there are many, in White Noise serve as Jack's wake-up call to the destruction caused by human activities. As he finally sees the world as it truly is, Jack struggles with accepting that his place within it is one of insignificance ultimately. Fromm states that once man has reached a level of dominion over his environment, quote, a new trouble rears its ugly head. A man's nurturing environment threatens to stop nurturing and start killing, end quote. Rather than the airborne toxic event drastically changing his town or landscape, it simply peters off to a slow end, affecting not many beyond Jack. As a result of this non-apocalyptic ending to the event, Jack must begin rationalizing what has happened, recreating a home in the disaster's footprint. It is because he did not meet his end in the toxic event that Jack truly begins struggling with his acceptance of death. His idea that it is because of the toxic event that he is, quote, scheduled to die, end quote, is nearly satirical, as all living beings are already scheduled to die. It is in their nature. What is truly at the heart of Jack's existential crisis is the fact that he must confront his death, which also means confronting his life, and ultimately his consumerist lifestyle of wealth and its associated waste and ecological destruction. One thing White Noise does particularly well in the midst of Jack's personal existential struggle is to highlight the environmental destruction caused by capitalism in poor and marginalized countries around the world. Prior to the toxic event, Jack and his family find great relief and near joy in watching the environmental violence happening on their TV in other parts of the world. Quote, we were otherwise silent, watching houses slide into the ocean, whole villages crack and ignite in a massive advancing lava. Every disaster made us wish for more, for something bigger, grander, more sweeping, end quote. It is the family's consumptive lifestyle, this time in the form of media consumption, that not only allows them to watch people suffer and the natural world tear apart, but to do it with a rapt delight, leaving them wishing for more and bigger disasters. The family gets just what they want only a short time later in the book as the airborne toxic event begins. Standing in the attic with his son to observe the cloud, Jack seems flabbergasted because the natural world he is observing is not the same one the media has shown him, stating, quote, these things happen to poor people who live in exposed areas. Society is set up in such a way that it's the poor and the uneducated who suffer the main impact of natural and man-made disasters. We live in a neat and pleasant town with a quaint name. These things don't happen in places like Blacksmith, end quote. In one of the few instances where it feels DeLillo is speaking directly to the reader through his character's response, the reader is left contemplating the reality of the previous sentence, wondering not if these disasters only happen to poor people, but if that is the only reality presented through the media coverage of such events. Upon further consideration, one begins to wonder why these disasters happen with astoundingly greater frequency in poor communities. It is this type of introspective commentary in 1985 that leads to later environmental justice movements which recognize that capitalist society outsources its hazards to poor and marginalized communities. I argue this is the point DeLillo is attempting to make with his character's cavalier attitude about watching death and natural destruction on TV, and Jack's commentary about what type of people are affected by environmental disasters. Years before Rob Nixon's call for activist writers, DeLillo opened up a space for a discussion of the environmentalism of the poor. By connecting not just back to nature, but back to a community with an ecological focus, the character of Jack finally begins to accept his place in the natural world and the physical death that is part of it. An ecological community is an idea that stems naturally from Morton's more individualistic ecological thought. Ecological communities allow for a community-level processing of the environmental degradation that persists in the immediate landscape and provides a support system to adjust to a new reality following a natural disaster. These communities are important on an individual level, with many psychologists finding a link between the destruction of nature and human mental illness. Jack, as well as his wife Babette, experienced these mental health issues through severe anxiety following the airborne toxic event, including a near obsessive level of concern over their ultimate deaths. It is this large-scale disaster that spurs a sense of isolation and death as a result of the upheaval from their home during the community exodus from the spill site. The upheaval from their modern life of conveniences causes a spiritual death, leaving them feeling without purpose. The loneliness that this spiritual death causes upon its realization forces a type of primitive nostalgia, creating in Jack an awareness of humans' loss of innocence, spurring him to commune with nature once again. This longing leads Jack to seek a community based on ecological perspective, where he can bounce ideas about death off others to recognize his own mortality. Jack seeks out emotional connections when he is at his lowest. Whether consciously or not, his relationships with others after the toxic event allow him to develop a sense of community where he was lacking one before. He approaches Babette, his daughter Denise, his father-in-law Vernon, and even his wife's other man Mink as a means of connection when he feels his world spiraling. Ultimately, it is once again his co-worker Murray who offers the most profound insight on death, telling Jack, quote, "This is the nature of modern death. It has a life independent of us. We've never been so close to it, so familiar with its habits and attitudes. We know it intimately," end quote. This conversation about the ecology of death with Murray allows Jack a renewed sense of understanding as he begins to view death not as some ultimate curse, but rather as part of the natural cycle of things, while still holding out the recognition that death through a man-made disaster is still unnatural in some ways. Jack's sense of the community's reaction grows as he sees outside of himself, observing, quote, "The toxic event had released a spirit of imagination. People spun tales, others listened spellbound. We were no closer to believing or disbelieving a given story than we had been earlier, but there was a greater appreciation now. We began to marvel at our own ability to manufacture awe," end quote. Not only has Jack reached toxic consciousness, but he is beginning to engage in ecological thought by understanding the community built around the airborne toxic event, allowing him a way of participating in the culture surrounding the disaster. There is an ecological connection between the people who have experienced this event that draws them together in ways they were not before, creating an enmeshed connection between their lives and the environment. Clearly lacking prior to the toxic event, as Jack was satisfied to hide amongst the piles of possessions within his own house, a sense of connection to others in his world has been awakened, allowing Jack to accept his place in the community and his larger role within the natural world. The book ends, as this essay also will, with the once mundane but now glorious sunsets dramatized through their interaction with an unnatural disaster and humans' harnessing of the biological world. The sunsets of the book represent a greater metaphor for the ecological journey Jack has taken as a result of his brush with death through environmental contamination. They have become a meeting place for a community formed from destruction, where the speed of capitalist society briefly slows and a community absorbs itself in nature, even if only for a few fleeting minutes a night. Jack observes a bond that has built around the sunset, saying, quote, "Something golden falls, a softness delivered to the air. It is not until sometime after dark has fallen, the insects screaming in the heat, that we slowly begin to disperse, shyly, politely, car after car, restored to our separate and defensible selves," end quote. The viewing of the sunsets represents an ecological community, one formed from environmental destruction. Community viewing allows a type of natural transcendence that rises above humanness to the ecological, where the townfolk no longer seek a new world, but rather see the beauty in this new version of the previous one. Had the airborne toxic event not occurred and the biological microbes not reacted to the cloud as they did, and had Jack, as must have many affected others, not stopped to contemplate death as a natural reality, these sunsets may appear as simple as they once did. The sunsets have redirected the destruction, making post-ecological spaces, allowing for community-level healing of all affected beings. Ultimately, Jack sums it up best, bringing the ecological conversation back to one that starts at the most basic natural levels of energy cycling, remarking, quote, "But in the end, it doesn't matter what they see or think they see. This is the language of waves and radiation, or how the dead speak to the living," end quote. Thank you.